If you were an owner of a BMW about 20 years ago, you could appreciate their inline six-cylinder engines were a staple of the brand. Then about 15 years ago, they started something new, and it was turbocharging their inline six-cylinder engines, starting with the N54 back in 2007, and then all of a sudden, you started to understand what it meant to have unreliable drivetrains, from coolant leaks, oil leaks, catastrophic chain failures, to misfires because of bad fuel injectors, fuel pumps that wouldn't deliver, turbochargers and wastegates that were rattling. BMW paid their dues, and they literally carved themselves one of the lowest spots in terms of reliability back in 2007 when they developed the first generation of turbo inline sixes. It only took BMW a few short years to figure out that there was some inherent real problem areas that they needed to address. Then they moved into an N55, which then of course was slightly revised in many different ways, which we'll talk about, and then they creeped up to the S55, which was the hot version, or essentially the M version of that N55, and then now they rolled into a B58, which dramatic changes and improvements which make that engine now truly a fundamental part of BMW's climb to success and overall reliability as a brand, making them one of the top European luxury cars for reliability today. I think it's just best I take it from the top, walk through all the different generation of engines, some of the big changes, and how we've got to today. I'm going to share you some specifications and advise to you which are the exact engine you're going to want to look and consider, because they all have their own specific attribute. Let's get into it now. Life's too short to drive boring cars. Everybody told me you want the N54, you want the N54 because that's the tuner special. You can do all kinds of great mods, it has great internals, and then you have yourself a bulletproof engine. Well, I didn't listen to all the naysayers. I only listened to all the people that talked about how tunable that N54 was. And the N54 was created from 2007, 08 till 09, in which in 2010 that they revised and they updated to the N55. But in the N54, I bought myself a 2007 335i with that glorious N54. Mine was rear-wheel drive only, 6-speed manual gearbox, silver. It was a hot rod. It had sport suspension. I love that car. Only had about 95,000 kilometers on it when I bought it, and I thought I had myself a real gem. Well, I should have thought twice about that because I did a lot of research, and everybody says it's the tuner special. And while there's a lot of guts and glory to that, in fact true, there is forged internals. In other words, forged crankshaft, forged connecting rods, but a cast piston, which made the internals very stout and solid, ready for a lot of tuning. Of course, it had other parts, electric water pump, piezo injectors, as well as a high pressure fuel pump because it was a direct injected engine today. The N54 had a 7,000 RPM redline, a 10.2 to 1 compression ratio, which was pretty typical for most engines running on a turbo. It had an open deck cooling design on the case, and as well it came with twin turbo, that's right, not one, 2 turbochargers strapped to that engine. Now all of this goodness bolted onto 3 liters displacement was providing you with an output of about 300 horsepower in stock form. Now everybody promised with some minor tune you can get that up to 600 horsepower no problem. As a matter of fact, there's many tuners that have proven that engine's good for up to about 1,000 horsepower. While that takes a lot of effort, often it means high boost, oversized turbochargers, running E85 fuel, and a host of other relatively minor mods. It didn't take very much to actually get yourself into those horsepower numbers. Here I thought that was my ingredients. I wanted to tune this car up and make it mine. Well, it didn't take me very long to figure out. The previous owner that sold me the car, 95,000 kilometers on it, already had the factory recalled high pressure fuel pump that went sideways. The piezo fuel injectors were a notorious problem, and BMW figured that out pretty quickly in short order because in the N55 that preceded the N54, they no longer had the piezo injectors. My wastegate started to rattle, which is a common phenomenon, as did I start to develop many leaks from various places, from rad hoses to vent lines to water pumps and thermostats. The oil filter housing started to leak because there's a cooler that goes through that, so I was leaking oil and antifreeze. Valve cover gaskets were another problem area. These engines were plagued with issues. Now everybody who loves the N54 will appreciate that it's probably one of the best engines for value-oriented people looking to do-it-yourself, build your own budget, high-performance DIY tuner car. There's really no better platform for it, just for the simple fact that you can get into one of these cars in relatively decent shape for under $10,000. So if we can summarize the N54, reliability down in the toilet, performance potential, one of the best. Then of course in 2010 we moved to the N55. There was a lot of similarities. It still had the 3-liter turbocharged engine, but this time, instead of having 2 turbos, they shed one of them and they resulted in 1 turbocharger, but they called it twin scroll single turbo. It also had approximately 10.2 to 1 compression ratio, open deck design as well, which is clearly not quite as robust as a proper closed deck design, which you would find in the S55 or the M version, or essentially the M3 or M4 shared engines. But this new N55, as most people found out, were slightly less tunable. The ceiling of performance tunes were a little bit lower, closer to about 700 horsepower in most cases. These N55s also had a 7,000 RPM redline. They outputted about 300 horsepower from stock as well. But a key difference was the internals and the guts were not quite as robust as you would find in the N54. These parts were primarily cast internals in the N55. Now the N55 was really tuned and designed to flush out some of the problems that you had with the N54. Of course, they shed the piezo injectors. They brought in a Bosch solenoid style direct injection injector. Of course, they upgraded the high pressure fuel pump, and things on the injection side were vastly improved from the N54. Unfortunately, it still carried the problematic and leaking electric water pump, which you could also expect to replace in about 60, 70, or 80,000 miles of its original life. They just didn't last very long. So all in all, the N55 was sort of the halfway house. Great value, increased reliability, although not as good as later models. They were certainly vastly better than the N54, and the tunability was still there to some degree. Then along is the S55, which is strongly derived from the N55. A lot of it is very similar, but they grossly beefed up the internals. And the S55, which was the engine that they shoehorned into the M3 and M4 cars, was vastly better than the N54 and the N55 in that they upped the engine RPM to 7,500 to allow better breathing and cam tuning as part of the magical ingredients to up the horsepower to a stock 424 horsepower. Now there's a few things to note on the S55. Everything was beefier. A lot of people say that the S55 and the N54 were very similar internally, and while that was partially true because they both had forged crankshafts as well as forged connecting rods, they also had both cast pistons, which were actually quite stout. The S55 did also have a 10.2 to 1 compression ratio and also used a Bosch style solenoid type direct injected injectors.
Let's do that again, all right?
Now the S55 was also a 3-liter in displacement, but instead of N55's single turbo twin scroll, the S55's overall output capability was much increased because they added another turbo, and so they tuned that engine with dual turbos, higher engine RPM rate, more boost pressure, and overall better, beefier engine and drivetrain combination. One other key thing to note, the S55 now had a closed deck design over the N54 and N55, which made it vastly more improved than the other two engines. Also to note that the S55, now BMW started to figure this out and realized that the electric water pumps weren't a good combination. Put all that heat around that water pump and near the turbos, and you had a recipe for disaster, imminent failure. That's right. So in the S55, they added a mechanical water pump on a pulley, which was vastly more reliable, simple, and effective, like 90% of the cars on the road today. Go figure. The other thing to notice with the S55, it not only did it come stronger in stock format, but tuners were able to drive the output up to as much as 1,300 crank horsepower out of a S55 engine just because of its fundamental strength improvements and enhancements in the case and the forged internals and the twin turbo capability and the breathing and the fueling. It's just a better engine with more potential than any of its predecessors in the turbocharged BMW world. Now, a special thing to note is, of course, we're talking about direct injected engines, all of the above. So carbon fouling is a potential issue with a lot of these engines, as is coolant leaks coming from water pumps, whether mechanical or electric water pumps. A lot of the hard connected plastic components and fittings that a lot of times BMW is using, those are all potential leak points, as is the plastic rads. The oil filter housing is known for oil leaks as well as coolant leaks, as does the valve cover gasket. Those are all potential leak points in all of these engines that we've mentioned. You're going to guaranteed see some forms of leaks throughout the different generations. Also unique to mention with the S55, as similar to the N54, with the forged parts, the crank hub assembly issues that you can see where they back out. Hard shock, particularly in the double clutch cars, there have been a small percentage of cars that actually see a failure, a potential failure, especially if you're running harder power. So let's just roll right in to the next and the current generation of the turbo inline 6-cylinder engines, and it's called the B58. Now the B58 is considered relatively reliable enough for Toyota to actually adopt it. Yes, the B58's used in a lot of different chassis in the BMW lineup. 243, 4, 5, 6, 7, 40 BMWs all use that B58 potentially in their lineup, as you can also find it in X3s, X4s, 5s, and X6 and X7s. That B58 is a very popular engine because it's stout, robust, versatile, provides enough economy and performance in one solid little package, but it was also proven to be reliable enough for Toyota to adopt that engine and shoehorn it into their latest Toyota Supra. Many would consider it the closest thing to a modern day 2JZ, where you've got the 3-liter turbocharged 6-cylinder engine making over 300 ponies. Seemed like the perfect recipe, right? Well, the reliability is just enough there too, and adequate for Toyota to accept this engine. So let's talk in a little detail on the B58, which is clearly the engine that has shoveled BMW out of that mountain of crap that they've been in for the last dozen years due to reliability issues. The B58's wonderful. Let's take it from the top. Number one, a slight bump increase in cc's, but the overall displacement is still roughly 3 liters. Also, what you have is a slightly smaller bore with a longer stroke and an overall compression ratio that's been increased from about 10.2 from all of those old engines to 11.0 to 1, meaning its off-boost performance is going to be a little more sprightly, and it's giving a higher level of performance without turbocharging. Another big win is it's essentially almost a hybrid between the S55 and the N55, and then has forged crankshaft and forged connecting rods, cast piston. Still quite very, very durable. It does have a closed deck design though, more from what you're finding with the S55, so clearly developed for increased reliability, durability for the long haul over any of its predecessors aside from the M versions. It still has a top RPM of about 7,000 into the red, and it produces now about 330 horsepower. Some say it's actually slightly sandbagged in that a lot of times people are saying it's more like 330 to the wheels rather than the flywheel power. So this engine's putting out a lot of decent power and has great potential. Now, with all of that said, the top known performance output that anybody's tuned these yet is about 650 horsepower range. So clearly they haven't fully unlocked the potential of the wonderful B58 engine. Another positive over the N54 originally was the N54 and the piezo injectors, as we already mentioned. This also now carries the Bosch solenoid type fuel injector. So clearly much more reliable there, as well as the fuel pump makes the fuel system much more reliable. The cooling system's much more dependable too, because they also forego the electric water pumps from the N54 and N55, and now it's actually got a pulley style mechanical type water pump, more similar to what you're finding in the S55 engine, the M version. So other key areas where the B58 was vastly improving and modernizing the cylinder head. We also have heat encapsulation designed into this modular type engine. There's a complete new redesign on the timing chain assemblies, which is proving to be far more reliable than outgoing engines. There's also an overall coolant system upgrade, not just the water pumps and the thermostats, but also there's 2 tanks for the coolant system. One, of course, is your standard cooling, and the other one is a provision to accommodate your air-to-water intercooler. And clearly a stronger bottom end makes this engine designed for durability and longevity. Much more vastly improved than any of its predecessor non-M engines before it. So the future is quite promising for BMW. Yes, you can guarantee there's still going to be some issues. You're still going to have coolant leaks because they're still using those lock fittings with the snap rings. You're still going to have the crack splitting, heating, cooling cycles that are going to cause premature leaks. You're going to have the oil filter housing leaks on both ends from coolant to oil. You're going to have the valve cover gasket leaks, pan gasket leaks. There's still all of those potential leak points. However, you're going to do away with some of the injection related issues. There's one less turbo to deal with. You've got an overall stronger bottom end, and the overall engine as a whole will likely need a little less maintenance than the N54 and N55 before it. So it's clearly trending in the right direction. Now, which is the engine for you? Well, I gotta want to start with the N54. The N54 is the engine for those that strictly want to DIY. You're okay with wrenching on it. Maybe it's not your daily driver, but you love fixing stuff and you want to have big tuning potential. and you know what you're getting into with reliability, guess what? The N54 is your engine. The S55 is clearly the next best tuner engine because the potential is so high, the ceiling on that. Add E85 and some of the big tune to it, and you can expect to see over 1,000 horsepower in the S55. Clearly, probably the best balance between durability, reliability, tunability, and overall engine is the S55, but that comes at a premium cost. Second to that is the B58. All of the revisions for durability are in place. Sure, you can tune it a little bit, you can have some fun with that engine, but overall, you're buying a B58 because you want that fun performance and you just want reliability. And those are the things you value most from your engine. You get into the N55 where you didn't want all the floppiness of the N54, but you want a little bit improved reliability, but you also don't want to spend an arm and 3 legs getting into your next used BMW. The N55 might be the best value-added engine that BMW offers right now in the used car market. Just because you can get into them for quite cheap. They are spread out across a lot of the lineup through the X vehicles and the sedans and the coupes. So it's a great engine overall, but truly the best standout engine is the S55 and then the B58. So clearly BMW is not quite out of the woods yet with some of the cooling fittings and all those odds and sods that can still potentially leak, but that's not unusual for a lot of other car manufacturers to deal with those types of issues. And with all of that said, it's clear that BMW is trending in the upward direction. They're increasing their reliability overall as a brand. Some of their other engines are getting better too, and we'll talk about that in other videos. But as a whole, would you believe it that the brand new BMW B58 is almost on par with anything you're going to find from a lot of the mainstream Japanese brands, almost from Lexus, Acura, and virtually every other Euro brand out there today. The B58 is a true winner. And with all of that said, be sure to check out that video. You're going to love it. How I drill into why the B58 engine is one of BMW's most reliable drivetrains of today. Hope to see each and every one of you on the next one. We'll catch you real soon. Bye-bye.